The FBI photo showed him in handcuffs. Perfectly styled hair, expensive suit, holding a suitcase with $1.8 million in cocaine, or what he thought was cocaine. John DeLorean, the man who'd promised to save Northern Ireland with stainless steel and gull-wing doors, had just destroyed himself trying to save a company that was already dead. 2 years earlier, the British government had given him £100 million. He'd promised 2,500 jobs and a revolution in automotive design. He delivered a car so badly engineered that doors cost more to build than an entire Honda Civic. By 1982, the factory was abandoned. 9,000 unsold cars were rusting in lots. Except they weren't rusting because stainless steel doesn't rust, which was the whole problem. And the most expensive automotive startup in history had collapsed into bankruptcy. Then, something impossible happened. A Hollywood director picked the failed DeLorean as a time machine for a movie called Back to the Future. The worst car in America became the most famous car on Earth. The $250 million disaster became immortal. This is how a cocaine bust, a government con job, and a flux capacitor turned the biggest automotive failure in history into a legend. John Zachary DeLorean was born in Detroit in January 1925, and that timing mattered. He came of age when Detroit was the center of the industrial world, when automobile manufacturing was synonymous with American power, when a smart engineer could rise from the factory floor to the executive suite in a single career. He watched that trajectory happen to other men. He decided it would happen to him, but faster. His father was a factory worker at Ford, violent, alcoholic, unstable. John learned 2 things from him: how cars were built and how not to live. He put himself through engineering school at Lawrence Tech and Chrysler Institute by working night shifts. Obsessive about details, obsessive about appearance. 6'4", movie star handsome, and absolutely convinced that the automobile industry was run by old men with obsolete ideas. By the time he graduated, he'd already identified the flaw in Detroit's system. They designed cars for engineers and accountants, not for drivers. Someone, he thought, should fix that. It might as well be him. He joined Packard in 1952. Within 4 years, he was head of research and development. He moved to General Motors in 1956, and that's where the mythology really began. At Pontiac, he transformed a dying brand into the performance division, the GTO, the Firebird, the Trans Am. Cars that actually looked like they moved fast. By 1965, he was the youngest division head in GM history, 40 years old, running Pontiac, making $650,000 a year, about $6.2 million today, dating models and actresses, appearing in fashion magazines. He wasn't just successful, he was cool, which was not a word anyone had ever used to describe a General Motors executive before. But here's the thing about John DeLorean. His greatest strength and his fatal flaw were exactly the same quality. He genuinely believed that the rules other people followed didn't apply to him. At GM, that worked. He broke dress codes, ignored corporate hierarchy, launched products without proper approval, and the cars sold so well that nobody could fire him. The problem was that he started to believe his own press. He thought he was successful because he was special, not because he had the resources of the largest corporation on Earth behind him. When he left GM in 1973 to build his own car company, he took the confidence and the charisma. He left behind the institutional knowledge, the supply chains, the quality control systems, and the money. Those, it turned out, mattered more. The DeLorean Motor Company was founded in October 1975 with a simple premise. American cars were boring, unreliable, and designed by committee. John DeLorean would build something different. A sports car, ethical, safe, efficient, stainless steel body that would never rust, gull-wing doors because they looked like science fiction, mid-mounted engine for perfect weight distribution. The DMC-12 wasn't just a car. It was a statement about what American engineering could be, if you removed the corporate bureaucracy and let a genius work. He raised $200 million from private investors, celebrities, and car dealers who believed in the vision. The prototype looked incredible. Low, angular, futuristic. Giorgetto Giugiaro designed it, the same man who'd shaped the Lotus Esprit and the Maserati Bora. The doors opened upward like a spaceship. The stainless steel body caught light like a mirror. When DeLorean unveiled it, the automotive press lost their minds. Here, finally, was an American company that understood style. Here was a car that looked like 1985, not 1965. But building a prototype in a design studio and manufacturing 10,000 units in a factory are completely different problems. The gullwing doors looked stunning. They also required custom hinges, gas struts, and sealing mechanisms that didn't exist yet. The stainless steel was beautiful and maintenance-free. It was also impossible to stamp into complex curves, impossible to repair if dented, and so thermally conductive that the interior became an oven in summer. The mid-mounted engine provided perfect balance. It also made routine maintenance require removing half the car. Every single design choice that made the DeLorean visually distinctive made it nightmarishly expensive to produce. DeLorean needed a factory. He needed workers who could handle stainless steel fabrication. He needed a government willing to subsidize an unproven startup. In 1978, he found all three in the last place anyone expected: Belfast, Northern Ireland. Belfast in 1978 was a war zone. The Troubles were at their peak. Unemployment in Catholic neighborhoods was pushing 30%. The British government was desperate, not just for jobs, but for anything that might provide hope, that might give young men a reason not to join the IRA. When John DeLorean walked into Stormont with his stainless steel dream, he wasn't just offering employment. He was offering a future. The Northern Ireland Development Agency offered him everything: £100 million in grants and loans, a factory site in Dunmurry, West Belfast, workforce training programs, tax incentives, infrastructure support. In exchange, DeLorean promised 2,600 jobs in one of the most economically devastated communities in Western Europe. The British government knew the risks. They had engineers assess the design. They had accountants review the business plan. Every technical report came back with red flags. The manufacturing process was unproven. The timeline was impossible. The sales projections were fantasy. But the political pressure overrode the technical reality. Northern Ireland needed this to work, so they decided it would. Construction began in October 1978. DeLorean hired workers from the shipyards, the textile mills, the unemployment lines. Most had never built cars before. That was fine, he said. They'd learn. He brought in manufacturing experts from Lotus to set up the production line. He ordered the most advanced robotic assembly equipment available. The factory rose in 18 months, 120 acres, state-of-the-art, capable of producing 30,000 cars per year once fully operational. In January 1981, the first DMC-12 rolled off the line. Journalists flew in from around the world. Politicians gave speeches about Northern Ireland's industrial renaissance. John DeLorean stood in front of the cameras and promised that this was just the beginning. The car cost $25,000, about $85,000 in today's money. For that price, you got a 130 horsepower V6 engine, borrowed from a Peugeot, that could barely push the heavy stainless steel body to 60 miles per hour in under 9 seconds. You got gull-wing doors that leaked in rain. You got an interior that looked like it came from a 1970s Renault, because it did. You got a car that overheated in traffic, stalled in humidity, and required specialist mechanics because no normal repair shop knew how to work with stainless steel. What you did not get was performance, reliability, or value. But you got attention. God, did you get attention? The first problem was quality. The Belfast workers were skilled and willing, but they were learning a manufacturing process that even experienced automotive engineers didn't fully understand. Stainless steel panels arrived from the supplier with microscopic scratches that became visible under certain light. Door alignments were off by millimeters, which meant they didn't seal properly. Electrical systems failed because the routing diagrams were incomplete. Cars were shipped to dealers with defects that required immediate repair. Some arrived and wouldn't start. The warranty claims began immediately. The second problem was the market. DeLorean had projected selling 30,000 units in the first year. That number was based on nothing. Not market research, not dealer commitments, not realistic production capacity. Just optimism. By mid-1981, the factory was producing about 50 cars per day, far below the break-even point. Dealers were returning unsold inventory. The American sports car market was collapsing under fuel efficiency regulations and insurance costs. And the DMC-12, for all its visual drama, wasn't actually fast. A Corvette cost the same and would humiliate the DeLorean in any straight line. A Porsche 924 cost less and handled better. The DeLorean's only advantage was novelty, and novelty doesn't sustain a $25,000 purchase. The third problem was money. The 100 million pounds was supposed to cover factory construction, tooling, initial production, and working capital until the company reached profitability. But DeLorean had burned through it by late 1981. The manufacturing costs were double the projections. The defect rate meant constant rework. The slow sales meant inventory was piling up in dealer lots instead of generating revenue. He went back to the British government for more funding. They were furious. The jobs existed, yes, but the company was hemorrhaging money. Still, they couldn't let it fail. Not yet. Not with 2,500 workers depending on those paychecks. They extended another 10 million pounds. It bought 6 months. By early 1982, the situation was terminal. The company owed $85 million to creditors. Production had slowed to a trickle. American dealers were refusing new shipments. DeLorean was flying between Belfast, New York, and Los Angeles, trying to find investors, trying to restructure debt, trying to keep the fantasy alive. He pitched new models, a sedan, a convertible, an electric version. He pitched a buyout to GM. He pitched joint ventures to anyone who would listen. Nobody bit. The numbers were too bad. The product was too flawed. The market had moved on. Then, in October 1982, John DeLorean walked into a hotel room at the Los Angeles Airport Marriott and handed an undercover FBI agent a suitcase that he believed contained $1.8 million worth of cocaine. He thought he was completing a drug deal that would provide the cash infusion to save his company. He was actually completing a federal sting operation that would destroy what remained of his reputation forever. The photograph that appeared in every newspaper the next morning showed John DeLorean, tanned, perfectly styled hair, expensive suit, being escorted out of the hotel in handcuffs. The fallen executive, the desperate criminal, the dream that ended in a DEA raid. He would later be acquitted, successfully arguing entrapment. The FBI had targeted him precisely because he was vulnerable, because they knew he needed money, because a failing car company made him the perfect mark. But the acquittal didn't matter. The damage was permanent. 6 weeks after his arrest, the DeLorean Motor Company filed for bankruptcy. By then, the factory had already stopped production. There was no money for materials, no money for payroll, no money for anything. The Belfast workers showed up one morning and found the gates locked. 2,500 jobs gone in a single day. The British government seized the assets to recoup whatever fraction they could of their investment. They found a factory full of unsold cars, approximately 2,500 units sitting in various states of completion. They found tooling worth millions that was completely useless for manufacturing anything except DeLorean bodies. They found a stainless steel dream that had cost the British taxpayer £100 million and produced exactly 8,583 completed vehicles over 2 years of operation. Think about that for a second. The total development and manufacturing cost worked out to roughly $30,000 per car produced, not counting the $25,000 retail price. The company lost money on every single unit. There was no path to profitability. There never had been. The entire enterprise was built on hope, charisma, and the willingness of governments to gamble public money on private fantasies. The dealers who had paid deposits never received their cars. The investors who had believed in John DeLorean's vision lost everything. The workers who had built the future in a Belfast factory went back to unemployment lines. And John DeLorean, acquitted of trafficking charges but destroyed in reputation, spent the next 2 decades fighting lawsuits, writing memoirs, and insisting that he'd been sabotaged by jealous competitors and corrupt governments. He never accepted that the car was simply a bad product, badly made, badly timed. Until his death in 2005, he maintained that the DMC-12 was a masterpiece that the world hadn't been ready for. And then something very strange happened. In July 1985, 3 years after the bankruptcy, a film called Back to the Future was released. The protagonist, Marty McFly, traveled through time in a modified DeLorean DMC-12 fitted with a flux capacitor invented by an eccentric scientist. The car was chosen for one reason. It looked like a time machine. The stainless steel body, the gull-wing doors, the angular design, all the features that made it impractical as a sports car, made it perfect as a science fiction prop. Director Robert Zemeckis initially wanted to use a refrigerator for the time machine, then switched to a car for practical reasons. He picked the DeLorean because it looked futuristic and because, crucially, the company no longer existed, so there were no licensing complications. Back to the Future became the highest-grossing film of 1985. It spawned 2 sequels. It became a cultural touchstone. And suddenly, the DeLorean DMC-12, a commercial disaster that barely anyone had wanted to buy 3 years earlier, became one of the most recognizable vehicles on Earth. Children who had never heard of John DeLorean knew what a DeLorean looked like. The car that couldn't find 30,000 buyers in 2 years became an icon that appeared on posters, lunchboxes, video games, and museum exhibits. The irony is almost too perfect. John DeLorean spent $250 million trying to build a car people would want. He failed completely. Then a Hollywood screenwriter spent $0 and made that same car immortal. The DMC-12 is more famous now than it ever could have been as a successful product. There are DeLorean clubs, DeLorean conventions, DeLorean restoration specialists. The remaining cars, maybe 6,500 still exist, are worth more today than they sold for in 1982. Not because they're good cars, they're still slow, unreliable, and impractical. But because they represent something larger, a future that never arrived, a dream that failed spectacularly, and a weird second life granted by fiction. First lesson: charisma is not a substitute for engineering. John DeLorean could sell a vision better than almost anyone in American business. He convinced investors, governments, and journalists that he would revolutionize the automobile industry. But vision doesn't make stainless steel easier to stamp. Confidence doesn't solve thermal expansion problems. Charm doesn't reduce manufacturing costs. The DMC-12 failed because the fundamental engineering was flawed, and no amount of showmanship could fix that. Compare this to Tesla decades later. Elon Musk sold a similar vision of disrupting Detroit. But Tesla spent years solving battery technology, manufacturing automation, and supply chain logistics before scaling production. DeLorean skipped that part. He believed passion would overcome physics. It didn't. Second lesson: government money is not free money. The £100 million from Northern Ireland came with political expectations that had nothing to do with building a viable car company. The British government needed jobs and hope more than they needed a functional business. That misalignment of incentives doomed the project from the beginning. DeLorean took the money knowing he couldn't meet the sales projections, and the government gave the money knowing the business plan was fantasy. Both sides lied to themselves because the truth was unacceptable. When Jaguar or BMW builds a factory, they do it because the economics work. When governments fund startups for political reasons, they get political outcomes, which is to say, expensive failures. Third lesson: luxury brands require luxury execution. DeLorean wanted to compete with Porsche and Corvette, but Porsche had decades of racing heritage, obsessive German engineering culture, and a reputation for reliability. Corvette had GM's manufacturing infrastructure and 70 years of institutional knowledge. DeLorean had a factory full of unemployed shipyard workers learning automotive assembly on the job. The gap between the brand positioning and the actual product quality was fatal. You cannot charge premium prices for sub-premium quality, not for long. The initial novelty brought some buyers. The warranty claims and breakdowns ensured there would be no repeat customers and no word-of-mouth growth. Fourth lesson, specific to this story: sometimes failure is the best marketing. The DeLorean Motor Company sold 8,583 cars and lost $250 million. If it had succeeded, if it had sold 30,000 units per year and become a sustainable niche manufacturer, the DMC-12 would be remembered like a Bricklin or a Vector, obscure 1980s sports cars that a few enthusiasts collect. Instead, the spectacular collapse, the cocaine bust, the Hollywood resurrection, all of that made the DeLorean a legend. The car is famous because it failed. The story is compelling because it's a tragedy. If John DeLorean had built a merely good car company, nobody would remember his name. The Dunmurry factory stood empty for years after the bankruptcy. Eventually, it was demolished. Today, it's a business park. Offices, light industrial units, nothing that hints at what was there before. You can still find people in Belfast who worked on the line, who remember the excitement of those first months, who thought they were building the future. They weren't wrong exactly. They were building something, just not what they'd been promised. There are about 6,500 DeLorean DMC-12S left in the world. A company in Texas bought the remaining parts. Inventory and trademark rights. They restore and service the existing cars. There are occasional rumors of a new DeLorean model, updated with electric motors and modern technology. Those rumors never materialize. The DeLorean exists now only as a monument to ambition without execution, to style without substance, to the strange reality that sometimes the worst business decisions make the best stories. At its peak, the DeLorean Motor Company employed 2,500 workers and produced 9,000 sports cars. Today, those cars are museum pieces and movie props. John DeLorean died in 2005, still insisting he'd been sabotaged, still believing his own mythology. The British taxpayer lost £100 million, and a stainless steel car that nobody wanted to buy became one of the most famous automobiles ever built. Not despite its failure, but because of it. Here's what remains. The machine was flawed, the dream was impossible, and the man was brilliant and broken in exactly equal measure. But the doors still open upward, the steel still doesn't rust, and somewhere, a 12-year-old is watching Back to the Future and thinking that car is the coolest thing they've ever seen, which means, in the end, John DeLorean got exactly what he wanted, just not the way he planned it.